Dan?
Yes.
And any emergency exit instructions? Do you have anyone there in person, or are we all on our own?
We don't have anyone here in person, so your emergency exit rules are the same ones you'd have if you were at home.
All right. Sounds good. So I don't know who we've got here from the public. Looks like we've got a couple folks. So first, I guess, any additions, deletions, or changes in the order from agenda items? Anyone have questions about that? Or
I have a couple of quick announcements, but I can put that under open forum if you'd like. They're not action items, they're just announcements.
okay, if you think it fits better there, we can take that part. Okay, so it sounds like we're on board. It's a pretty focused agenda tonight, I'd say. And then for folks from the public, any comments or additions or other items?
None from me.
All right.
No, thank you.
All right, super. All right, so the focus of tonight is really to start moving closer toward digging into actually working on the pathways and actions. So the sort of two aspects of that are, one, to look at the structure as it's evolved to date with the pathways and actions worksheet, which Anne and Melanie have revised a couple times with some feedback from a few of us. And then hopefully we'll spend most of the time actually working our way through some discussion about the actions. And the plan here is to have a little bit of time for everyone to get to make comments about sort of high-level observations. And I should say, the focus for tonight is on the buildings and thermal sector. So we're not going to try to tackle the whole worksheet. This is going to be, so in terms of the structure, it's the whole worksheet, but in terms of the content, it's buildings and thermal. Once we get through tonight, we hope we'll have a better sense for how does this work as a whole group? Does everyone have a sense for how this would look if we break into smaller groups, as we had talked about, to tackle the individual categories in some subgroups, and see if that's something we can use to move things along more quickly. So I guess the two comments that I would make as we're starting to look at the structure of this is we want to understand how we're going to use this worksheet to be able to move toward decisions about which actions we want to recommend and how do we frame that, right? So I think it would be most useful to get feedback about whether the structure of the worksheet is giving us the information we need to understand what the challenges of this item are, what the impacts would be if we could do it, what's required to do it, so that we sort of understand what's entailed and we can move toward that decision, right? So think as you're looking through, like, what information do you need, and is all that information on the sheet, or could it be clearer? And so that'll sort of be the first part. Andrew, do you have any other comments to help ground this discussion?
Only if we wanted to talk about the changes that were made to this spreadsheet and why. I don't know if that's a helpful thing to articulate now.
Yeah, maybe Anne or Melanie could sort of take us through what's here now and what has evolved since the last presentation.
Do you want me to share it on the screen?
Sure.
Well, can you give me the ability to share? You're muted.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, can everyone see? Everyone see the spreadsheet?
It's good. Yep.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, I can see it, but it's almost impossible to work with.
It's
I
tiny.
agree. I agree. There's too much information, too many columns.
The worksheet. So the worksheet is also in your packet. So
Yeah.
if it's helpful to sort of pull it up side by side and try to track along so you can scan around and drive on your own, that's an option. But thank you for zooming in. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay, hopefully that helps a little bit. So the big changes are that we added goals. We didn't have goal as a category before. Now we do. In order to inform the draft South Burlington goals, we provided you with the high-level goals from the Vermont Climate Action Plan and the Vermont Comprehensive Energy Plan. So if you feel like that's too much information to look at, we can always hide those, but they're there as reference if we want to know, what these draft goals were based on. So I can.
I just have a question as to why we can't just have separate worksheets for each of the, say transportation. That's all, just have one worksheet just for transportation because, the climate action, the comprehensive plan goals, they're basically all the same, for each of those, and having a separate column for each of those just makes it difficult to, it makes everything smaller and more crowded.
So
So-
Donna, hold that thought. If you wouldn't mind holding that thought.
I'll hold
I'll
that thought.
talking about the changes, and that's something we could totally do is just break it up into separate spreadsheets. But I'll just finish going over the changes real quick. So the draft pathways are just about the same as the last iteration. The metric for monitoring is about the same. You'll see we've added this row on top that explains what each of these columns are for, what they are. The next column is draft action. That was there before. Leaders was there before. When we met a smaller group, we decided to add a likelihood column and a feasibility column. Andrew could probably explain those two columns a little bit better than I could.
Sure, I mean, just real quick, I mean, the thought was that, and honestly, as I look at this, we may need to iterate a little bit around it, but the thought was column J would answer the question of if we did all these actions collectively successfully, would we achieve the goal? And then column K was intended to answer the question, can we achieve those actions, or what are the obstacles to achieving?
Isn't that column O?
Oh,
I see. Oh, never mind. Never mind. You're right.
and the idea of column K was that by identifying the obstacles, it would then kind of flesh out a bit more the actions, because you'd iterate around that. Okay, this is an obstacle. What do we need to do to overcome that obstacle? And so that was the idea of columns J and K. As I look at this, I'm actually not exactly sure how J and N relate. And so we may need to talk about that, but we don't need to do that right now.
Okay, so column L talks about who has authority. Right now, it's just a yes or no question asking if the city has authority. We might want to change that to be something like who has authority. There might be multiple entities that have to get involved. And then column M has to do with greenhouse reduction levels from each action. Actually,
You can actually do that?
it looks like M and N might be a little bit duplicative. Melanie, can you explain the difference between M and N?
Yeah, I think they are a duplicate. So I would pay attention to M. It says, will the action result in greenhouse gas reduction levels directly or indirectly? So directly would be an example of driving an electric vehicle. That is very measurable. Indirect is more of an educational action. And then we've also said to hold on this until the action list is more prioritized. Best practice with modeling the actions in ClearPath is to have a list down to about 20 to be able to very specifically analyze what the energy decrease potential is and what the emission potential is. So in the modeling software that we're going to use, it does have capability to give you an estimate on what the reduction on energy and emissions could be if implemented. But we're not there yet. We need to get the list more prioritized so that we're not modeling things that either can't be modeled or are not going to be a priority for the city. Does that help to clarify things?
It does for me.
Can I maybe ask one other follow-up question on the way that we're planning to model the emissions reductions? Are we primarily modeling at the pathway level or at the action level or both? And is it helpful for folks if we describe the distinction between those two anymore, or is everyone pretty solid on those?
We will be modeling at the action level to see how in a collective way can all the actions meet the goal. And as Anne indicated earlier, the goals for South Burlington are what the city pledged in 2017 that relate to the Global Warming Solutions Act and the Comprehensive Energy Plan.
So
So the last two columns that we have, there's an equity rating using the equity tool. And then there's information on cost if we want to include that.
Can I make a couple of comments? Yeah, so, I responded to Paul and Ethan by email. I think for the initial discussion, I think this matrix is okay. What I feel is based on other climate action plans I have reviewed. I have reviewed about 7 cities so far, which are well done, what I call them as well done, really well done climate action plans. The nuances are the key to defining more of the attributes, for example. So I think until we get a flavor for how the group articulates the specific actions with the right nuances, it may be hard to put those categories right now. So I have some suggestions and ideas, but I don't want to do them right now because it will derail into a different conversation. So I do think that there are other attributes that are worth adding, but I think we should go through the initial review first.
Yeah, as we narrow down pathways and actions to a shorter prioritized list, I think that my vision is that the actions will get written out in more detail, much more detail than they are right now.
Carolyn?
did you call me?
Yes.
Yeah, wait, I got it. Where am I? Sorry. So Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, well, I have a couple things. I agree that this is, sort of a massive thing. It's a fine structure eventually. But I think if we could not worry at those actions at the very end, everything is on hold until we get more specific and regular. So you're not even going to use those final columns, I don't think, right away. And we could bring them back in later, I guess is what I'm saying. So we have a more nimble document to work with. Also, I agree with Donna. I think you should eliminate the second column, that it is identical on every line of this multi-page document. So who needs it? You can put it up at the very top to say what the state goal is, but you don't need to have a separate column that says it on every line. That would simplify this. And then I just want to get clarity again. Are we saying that when we say the amount of reduction, is that collectively for all the actions in that particular sector? Or is it for each line, each action? So we're going to say, you're going to reduce this much if you have 2 workshops on weatherization. Or are you saying all of these things pulled together will have this amount of reduction? I'm not clear from this chart.
So I think Melanie explained it earlier that if it's educational, it will be an indirect
Right.
result, which you wouldn't be able to model. But there will be actions where there will be particular actions, not the whole sector, but an individual action that Melanie should be able to model and give an estimated greenhouse gas reduction for that action.
So some of them you're going to cluster together and some you're not. I can't get this.
Yeah, so in aggregate, with the action that we model, we will be able to determine how in aggregate the actions will advance the high level state/city goals. So even though here we have the action repeated or the goal repeated for each action, that is not to say that each action alone can contribute to that
Right.
goal. It's going to be an aggregation.
Okay.
We included them mostly on the worksheet because we had anticipated that this worksheet would be filtered and divided up by sector. So we didn't want to lose the CEP and the CAP goals, because those will be used and have been used to inform the draft South Burlington goal. So we just really wanted to make clear that that connection is there, and that we're bringing in the climate pledge, which was to advance the state goals.
Right.
So I apologize that it caused some confusion. We can certainly streamline that and make the document easier to use.
Melanie, just to maybe, I'm wondering, based on Darren's question, whether or not what we're really saying is that it's the estimated greenhouse gas reductions per pathway from all the actions listed under that pathway. Is that really what we mean?
Is it?
That's the question.
I know. I mean, is weatherization, we're going to say what that impact is by itself, or is it going to be put into all of the thermal? I don't know.
Or pathway by pathway.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
You know, in a sense, it's too soon to tell. But the way ClearPath works is it works at the action at the very specific level. And as we go through this, the the draft goal for South Burlington may change. So I think really like the focus should be on whether this worksheet process that we laid out will help you guys to do your work in identifying the actions that are appropriate to the sectors that we defined.
Okay.
Well, I personally don't think having columns C and D really help anything. It's just clutter. You know, we know that the goals are large, you know, and I think right now we're sort of in the brainstorming portion of this. And I think we need to be very clear about what the pathways need to be, that they, you know, there's a lot of questions that are kind of asked in here. It's like, let's just focus on those things that the city can do and kind of work our way from the large goal, you know, the large pathway, and work down to the details, because some of the things that you've listed as draft action, those are details. Those aren't the goal. You know, educating student drivers, that's not where you start. That's maybe one of the methods that you use to reach that goal. But I think if the document is just more clear, you know, allows us to brainstorm in a very structured way, that's kind of what we need right now. You know, all these other details can be added later on. And, you know, I agree with Darrell-Lynn that those things are important, but not right now. You know, it's like, you know, in some ways we have to look at what's possible as opposed to, you know, what we can achieve. Because I think the whole state, you know, when they looked at this and said, oh, well, this is how much we can achieve, all of that was focused on, are these goals actually achievable? What do you do to achieve these goals? And they didn't spell out any of that in the climate action plan that the state did. There's nothing in there that says how you get this done. You know, so I think that's what we have to focus on. How do you get, you know, how do you achieve these goals? How do you get people to do these actions?
Paul, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, two quick things. One, I think to the question that Darrell-Lynn and Andrew were speaking about, we will, Melanie, if I'm correct, have, you know, where we're at and therefore what our targets will be by sector, correct? So we're going to know the magnitude of what needs to be done within each sector, within thermal, within transportation. So I guess I'm envisioning that, you know, as we go through this process, as the needs within the sector are known, and from the ClearPath tool, the viability of each action, or the depth of each action comes to be known, we'll be able to see, are they matching up? Is that a correct statement?
It is, but I think, you know, some work will need to be done on, you know, just looking at the South Burlington goal and making sure that that's the right goal and it matches what the CEP and the CAP are. And, you know, we will go through the process with the actions so that we can model whether we're going to get that reduction benefit that we need to meet the goals.
Right, but I'm saying that the goals will be known more broadly than just the general goal that's stated there. They'll be known by sector, because we will know that transportation is 48% or whatever percent of our total emissions, right? Like we're gonna be able to break this down as we go forward. Because right now the goal is just across the board.
Yes.
Okay, that's what I'm saying, that
Yes.
as we go forward, we're going to be able to narrow it from both sides.
Right.
Yes. As a collective, we're going to need to narrow the goals down to the sectors, and it might be an iterative process with the actions.
So I have a question then for folks as we're talking about, because I'm hearing a lot of discussion, which I think is spot on for this exercise, which is, you know, what is the connection between the actions, and at what level of detail are we talking about? How do they actually connect up to the goals? And so I would ask folks' opinion on whether we have all the different sort of steps or levels of detail. Think about it backwards, right? I think it's sort of helpful, right? we have this high level goal, we have sector level goals, we have pathways that are within each sector that are a chunk of that sector's goal. And then eventually we're going to have, some level of chain of events back down to a very specific action, right? At the end of the day, what we need to get to are actions that says, this actor is going to do this thing, and we're going to be able to tell if it's done or not. And it seems to me that part of how we make the decision about whether we feel like that's the right set is that we have some understanding of how that original action then causes and causes and causes, and it rolls up to the effect that we want. And then we can decide, is that realistic? Is that commensurate effect for the amount of effort that goes in? Things like that, right? Those kind of questions. And so my, I guess what I would ask everyone is, do you feel like we have all of the sort of steps in that chain where you feel like you can look at a particular action and say, okay, we're going to do this and it's going to cause this and it's going to have this impact? Are we missing some things?
So Ethan, if I may, let's just take buildings and thermal, for example. So there are 12 rows that represents building and thermal. And in each row, either it is a single action or a combination of some actions, right? So at the end of tonight's exercise, that those actions that are listed for the 12 rows may look like 100, because I think I have proposed 10 or 15 other actions, specific actions. So each of us may have other specific actions to contribute to each of these pathways. Then we have the task of consolidating them and making sense out of how they fit together. So we may, I guess to my point, we may end up with a broad set of actions, a lot more than what we have in this list ahead of us. So that's how I'm thinking about it. The exercise now is to make sure that we propose all the actions that we can think of, and then figure out, does it make sense for the pathways listed so far?
I think that's right, Srini. We're going to expand before we can winnow, right?
Yeah.
So Ethan, I'm wondering if we can move on to the next step. If we're okay with this worksheet, do we need to have some consensus of approval, or?
Well, can we agree that we're not going to do those things at the far end, because we're going to have to be much more precise about what our actions, et cetera, are before we decide whether or not it is the likelihood that it will be achieved, what is the feasibility of doing it, what's the cost of doing it, what's those are things that I don't think we're going to take something right now and put it up here and then go all the way over across the whole line. We're not going to get to those questions until we see what I think our menu of actions are. And then we're going to be sorting and changing, and then we'll see where we are in terms of equity and in terms of cost. I mean, that's the way I would propose that you do it, is look at your menu of options. Yeah, and then we'll bring those back, but I wouldn't, it's just, we don't need those right now in this structure. We know we're going to get to them, but.
Yeah, I agree. I think you need to consolidate this so much more so that we can have something workable and printable. I mean, I couldn't even print this form, because it was too big for my printer. So I like to scribble things on spreadsheets and things like that. I couldn't even do that because the form is so unwieldy and it's got too many columns on it. So for a workbook, can we agree to eliminate those columns that right now aren't useful to us?
Can I just ask for a point of clarification or maybe some deeper reflection, and Michael, I'll get to you in a second, sorry. But I know that there are some of the columns that have been already tagged as due later because it's going to take some really detailed analysis. We've got to use some tools. We've got to do some quantitative analysis. And we know that there's no way that we can really even put a draft input in that. it strikes me that some of the other columns were there because they were things that we might comment on as we're considering these actions. And my question is, what do folks think that we're going to be using as our criteria when we get to that winnowing stage, right? The brainstorming is great. Like we can just throw actions out all day long until we have everything we've thought of, and that's fine, right? We know how that works. We don't need to fill out everything to do the brainstorming. But at some point along this process, we need to make a decision about how we're going to go down. And so I'm curious in terms of whether those other columns are good places to jot notes down about, here's my concern, or here's where I'm excited about this, or this is the pro or con of that. Are there
Okay.
other columns that we would want to keep track of as we go along? What do folks think we want to be able to bring for context to the actions, right? There's the action itself, but then there's
Right.
like, here's what we think about the action that's going to feed into our decision about, do we want to recommend this action into the final analysis process?
Good point.
Yeah,
What-
those things have a role those things have a role in winnowing. But I think the whole process needs to be a lot better defined, more than just throw a whole bunch of ideas out there. And, you know, I think even the, you know, I mean, there's a really more structured way. I'm just trying to encourage a much more structured way of approaching this, because I think this doesn't feel to me like the right structure to be approaching this with. You know, we know the overall goals. We know what the, you know, some of the pathways are, and we all have a lot of ideas on how we can approach that. But I think it has to be kind of a start with the large thing and then work down to the details, and always focus on, this is the city that's going to take these actions. What can the city actually do? So let's not propose things that aren't something the city can do, or, you know, wouldn't be able to do, or that's someone else's responsibility. Let's focus on what can South Burlington as a city do.
So Donna, just to bring that recommendation to a point, to make sure that we've captured it, can you identify some specific things that you see that are missing in the chain of how the specific action is going to connect to the larger goal that we should be capturing here as we add things to the list or work to add detail to the things on the list? You had mentioned last meeting about obstacles. Like, what are we doing? What are the obstacles that these actions are overcoming, and how are the actions going to result in better outcomes? Is that something that you think needs to be a column on this, or somehow represented here? Or are there other things that?
Well,
you
I think eventually you do, you know, that's part of the winnowing down process. But I think that, you know, one place that, I mean, we're supposed to read this, the part about just transitions, you know, and I found that a very important way of, you know, if we say reduce energy use in existing buildings, okay, existing buildings, break that down. Residential buildings, multifamily buildings, single family buildings, and each of those, and then look at just transitions. Are we talking about, you know, people who have capital and can afford to pay for things themselves? Are we, you know, people who can, you know, who are going to be in the homes for a long time, can take out loans, rental housing? You know, if you structure it that way, it just makes more sense, and it's just easier to go through. And then, you know, you're going to be looking at people without means. You know, you need to start thinking about the process by, you know, who are you targeting? And each one of those is a sub task, you know, and so, you know, so I agree, reduce energy use in existing buildings. You start from there. It becomes basically, you know, a type of, well, just you break it down from there. You know, and because there's so many, if you're thinking not so much about the task, but it's like, who are we targeting here? And then what do we need to do? It just, I think it can be a much more useful format for presenting our ideas. And then we're not ignoring the just transition, because I think just throwing out a lot of ideas, you just start right where they don't want you to start. They don't want you to ignore just transitions. You know, who are those people who can't afford this? How do we deal with those?
Mhm.
Okay. Um,
And, all
I
right,
don't-
just one other thing, or we can wait till you talk about the equity stuff, but I have a basic question about that. Because the
sorry,
base,
hang on a sec. Is Michael still here, or did you already leave, Michael?
No, unfortunately, Michael had to leave.
I just saw his chat, and I'm
oh, he had to leave.
yeah, he said he wasn't feeling well, and
He hasn't been feeling well, yeah.
yeah, so let me just briefly reflect on what just happened there with Michael not getting, and I realized that, you know, that's a unfortunate case where he left early. We should try to figure out how to keep our comments short so we can try to get through this. And I don't know if we want to, you know, sort of have timers and try to keep it tight, because I think we're going to have a risk of getting caught in the swirl of the discussion. And so I'm trying to draw out and see if we can like succinctly identify things that are missing or unnecessary on here, so that we can get to the second stage of adding things. Paul?
Just briefly to pick up on Donna's point, you know, I think that something that's maybe throwing me and others off is that some of the actions are fairly broad, like what we're seeing in number 23. That's a big program that will take a lot of different pieces. And some of the actions are a very, very precise thing, like in line 22. And so maybe they're hitting different levels.
Yeah,
I would encourage us to sort of focus on things like line 23 at this stage, and then the implementation plans could then break it down into all of its individual component parts. So, you know, just a thought in terms of level of where we're trying to achieve with this plan.
I just make a pitch for keeping column K, because I think feasibility is really important as we think about this. Because you think about feasibility, it forces you to think about the obstacles of the action, which then I think you can iterate around those obstacles and come up with more actions. Otherwise, we're going to have a plan which maybe looks really good, but it's just fantasy.
sure. No, it's a good question. We can keep it so we know that we checked the box or something. We're just trying to make this a little more nimble document to work on in the initial stage. But you're right, we could keep all of this.
And I don't think that just because a column is there means that it has to be filled out for every action before we can move on to the next step.
Thank God. Good.
So I guess I'm a little unsure of how everyone is feeling about this format. I've sort of heard some desire to winnow the number of things on here. I've also heard the desire to expand the amount of detail or to have some kind of different structure. I know there's also a desire to get down to the details and start actually talking about the actions. I guess what I would like to accomplish in terms of structure before we get into the actions is to feel like we have all of the things that we would want to be able to know about an action agreed to, so that as we throw actions out, we say, okay, we're going to document this action, make the notes that we need to make on it. Maybe there's some optional things that we may or may not be able to fill in, and be able to document it and then move on to document more things and then come back and do a second phase. That's a winnowing down. My concern is that it feels like where we are right now is that people have other things they want to be able to say about actions that aren't captured on here. And if that becomes a sort of free form, let's talk about the entire like system dynamics of each one of these issues, it's going to be very difficult to get through 20 or 30 actions. And it's going to be very difficult to know for each action, we're going to have discovered lots of great things about it and lots of terrible things about it. And then we're going to say, well, which ones are best? And we're going to have all this information that isn't very structured, which might be all good information, but I'm just concerned that I don't see that we're aligned about how we're going to move toward a decision with a particular structure. So I'm curious if folks have specific things they want to add to this, or if I'm reading the room wrong and everyone's totally happy with the structure right now, and we've all gotten stuff off our chest and we're ready to go on. Where are folks right now? I guess maybe just a quick like thumbs up, ready to move on. This is awesome. I'm totally committed to this thing. It's working for me. Thumbs down. This is a non-feasible. I want to go back to the beginning and work it out. In the middle, I have maybe one small change, or I'm willing to move forward with some reservations. How's everyone feeling about where we are?
I'll move forward with reservations.
All right. So
Well,
thumbs sideways for reservations.
I think Paul's point about fleshing some of this out with implementation details addresses a lot of the concerns that were expressed.
I'm sorry, Andrew, that you said fleshing out the implementation details, having a column for that.
Point that some of the actions will be fleshed out in the implementation plan. And I think that addresses the concerns that have been raised.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm okay with it if you basically take column E out and just put it at the top of the page.
Yeah, that's just a waste of space.
That's just crowded. That's just taking up space. It's important, but it's a top level thing. It's not a column.
That seems straightforward.
So you don't
Maybe
want.
if we try doing a few of these, we'll quickly see that this works well, you know?
Mhm.
Instead of talking about it, why don't we talk about it? I mean, take one, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I understand you want us to buy in on the structure, and we're all sort of, okay, let's do it.
So I
And then
agree
we'll-
with Donna that we don't really need column E. I would just keep in mind that it'll be important to understand the scale of each sector. Some sectors are small, some sectors are really big. So if we can, as we go forward, understand that, you know, to hit transportation and building thermal, there's a lot of stuff, you know, everything to achieve those, it's going to be a much bigger lift than agriculture.
Agriculture, right.
Within that framework, I totally agree with Daryl and with Donna.
Yeah, and I think, you know, once we talk, you know, if we're talking about residences, or even break down more, the number of units that get weatherized is going to be a lot easier to digest than this 80% giga, you know, greenhouse gas emissions. The percentage is hard to work with. It's how many houses we're focusing on that's really useful.
Would you like to hide that column for now? Would that work?
Yeah.
Okay. So currently we have so okay. So it sounds like folks would like to at least move on and try going through some of this and then see if the structure accommodates well enough. And it sounds like, so we're moving through the buildings and thermal sector.
Right.
And we can start by discussing the things on here, or we can start by, if folks have things they want to add to it, do we want to sort of maybe take a quick pass through and see if all of the actions on here are clear, or if there's any questions or clarifications, or if folks want to add information in one of the columns? Is that a good place to start to sort of test things out rather than going whole cloth with new actions?
Yeah.
Someone have a first action that they want to propose of the existing ones on here that that they think is a particularly interesting one to discuss, and they want to you know, add things to it or ask questions about what it means?
About is that like each of us would like spend, you know, a few minutes, 3 minutes, just kind of going through, and you know, each person would just have the floor kind of going through, talking about what they might add or change.
We can do that. I mean, I know folks have had a chance to talk, but now would everyone like to do that? Have where are we for time? We've got what, five of us. Am I counting that right? Yeah, we lost a couple tonight. So maybe you want to take like 2 to 3 minutes each, and we'll each take the floor and just give some succinct thoughts. And now I think just to be clear, we're moving on to the from the structure and talking about the content of at the high level. what you think are the priorities, concerns about types of things that you think, you're not as enthusiastic about having in here, or anything else you want to say. The floor is yours. Is that good? Andrew, do you want to go first?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just focusing on column H. So starting with the pathway reduce energy use in existing buildings. I think one thing I'd add is code enforcement as buildings are built. And then the second thing I just wanted to talk about is, the actions we've listed focus, and I understand why, on low to moderate income. But the truth is that the bigger homes are probably bigger energy hogs, or may well be. And I want to make sure we're not, that was solving the climate crisis, right? I mean, because that's what we're all here for. And so we shouldn't, forget that there's other folks that need to be incented to make their homes more efficient too, even if they're not low or moderate income. And how do we do that? That's kind of my comment on that set of actions, that pathway, I should say. Then on the switch out fossil fuel heating and cooling system pathway, I'd like to add, and again, this goes to feasibility, some kind of taxation mechanism, either that the city would phase in a tax on existing fossil fuel infrastructure, or give tax breaks for folks that have converted to non-fossil fuel infrastructure. And that may be more palatable, but either of those I think have lots of obstacles, but in my mind those are really important. And I wanted to just talk about and understand how this pathway is relates to the clean heat standard that the state may adopt, and whether if that clean heat standard is adopted, are there things that actions the city will need to take to facilitate that, or are we kind of done here, and the kind of state will take care of this this part? It's just not clear in my mind how those two things are kind of related, I guess. And I'd love to kind of flesh that out a bit. I think
30 seconds, please, Andrew.
What's that?
30 seconds more, please.
Yeah, okay. In terms of net zero, I think those are the right. I think those are the right things. In my mind, it's really the obstacles and identifying those obstacles, and what does the city have power to do or not, and if not, how does the city get the power? So those are my comments and thoughts on this.
Great, thank you.
Ethan, do you want me to provide an answer to Andrew's question about the heat standard?
Yeah, if
Okay.
or Paul, do you have a recommendation about?
Well, I guess I was just going to suggest that maybe we're taking notes on this. Why don't we let everybody go through first? Because I think we can easily get into a question answer, and then people won't all have had an opportunity. So maybe Melanie, make note of that.
Yep,
And
got it.
then we'll come back to it.
Great, thank you. Who would like to go next?
I could go. I've been
Okay.
scribbling down a few. I think one's very specific one that it's a way many communities in New York City did a lot of this with commercial properties, but that's benchmarking. Utilize Vermont Gas. Utilize whatever way you have of identifying houses and commercial properties as well that have very high energy use, and then figure out how to target people with high energy use. The efficiency programs have been doing that for a while, and find out from Vermont Gas, Green Mountain Power, what can the city do to further encourage that. ID rental properties with high energy use. CVOEO will work with rental property owners. More encouragement needs to be done to get the rental properties because they are sometimes some of the highest energy users. ID low-income people with high energy use, whether they're rental owners or a lot of low-income people are seniors or potentially recent immigrants. CVOEO will work with these people. Sometimes they don't speak English. Sometimes they just don't know how to access programs. CVOEO is one of the best resources we could possibly have, but sometimes people just don't know about them. Higher income people, as Andrew mentioned, Efficiency Vermont programs really work better for people with good income. High income and a lot of money and disposable income, but they just refuse to put that money into weatherization. They'd rather spend it on, jacuzzis or something, So we need a way of addressing the people who can afford to do this and just haven't. And then the working Vermonters who also have avoided doing weatherization, fuel switching and everything because they think they can't afford it. That's where the education comes in. They're probably the one place where you really just need education and convince people that for their kids, for whatever, this needs to be done. And then lastly, the realtors. We need to have a group of realtors who are supporting weatherization of existing homes and supporting net zero. We need to get a bunch of them to support this so that it's very unfashionable to not have a fully weatherized home and try to sell it on the market. And so those are some of my ideas.
Thank you, Donna. Okay, Srini.
Yeah.
Next.
I shared a spreadsheet with you and Paul with more comments, but I'll try to be concise here. And if you want, I can always write up some notes and send it your way as well. So let's just focus on the reducing energy in existing buildings. So the first one that I would like to suggest based on what Don already said is we need to code and certify buildings based on energy efficiency. I don't know if any of you read the article that I forwarded from BBC about UK. They have a system for coding buildings based on energy efficiency and thermal loss. So we need some kind of guideline. I mean, we may not have that many public buildings, but public and commercial buildings, we need to have some kind of visibility on what the opportunity is. So that's number one. Second is, I think we need a sustainable audit plan for energy efficiency. The agency that Donna talked about, their biggest issue is having resources to actually do the work. And from what I understand from Vermont Energy Cooperative, they don't have the resources to do the energy audits anymore. Now all they're providing is just come and give a list of vendors. Unless you pay for an energy audit, you don't get a proper energy audit anymore.
Right.
So let me pause there. So in reading all these climate action plan, what I am consistently picking up is not the high level goal, not the metric, not the milestones. What everyone is talking about is what policy that we need to consider, the city needs to consider. The second is what level of expertise, what type of expertise we need to provide to make this happen. And the third is what type of resources we need to provide. So along this energy audit, I actually think that the city could take a lead role in jumpstarting the audits, have a resource that works part-time. People maybe pay $200 for an energy audit. The rest of the cost is borne by the city. Jumpstart an energy audit program and have a bunch of audits done. That's number one. Second, Donna already talked about this in a private email to me. This is a prior idea. When a sale process goes through of a property, require that you have an energy audit. When we lived in Massachusetts, when we couldn't sell a property until the fire department came and inspected all the smoke alarm and fire alarms and
Right.
said that, yes, the property is ready to sell. So something like that, some kind of intermediate checkpoint to identify whether this building has got an opportunity to improve energy loss or not. So let me just stop there on the, so those are some of the, high level thoughts that I have on the reducing energy use in existing buildings.
Thank you.
I'm probably going to take more time. If you want me to stop here, I can stop and come back if time allows later on the other two building topics.
Yeah, I think we'll have plenty of chance to have some back and forth. This isn't the last chance everyone's going to get
Okay.
to speak and discuss. We'll get into the detail, but we wanted to make sure that everyone had a chance to get to make high level comments or the things that they're most passionate about before it gets lost. So yes, definitely we'll come back. Thank you, Srini.
Also, Srini, thank you for sending the written ones in advance. We did receive them. There's lots in there. Thank you.
Yeah. Great. Sarah Lynn, do you want to go next? Or do you-
Okay. Yep, I just have a couple because some of them have been covered. And that is just recognizing and reinforcing under the new buildings, we do have to establish and adopt a building code. And I think that's great. We should do that. We should use whatever regulatory powers we have, like Srini said. We should require that if you're going to sell a property, an existing property in South Burlington, it has to have a recent energy audit or whatever. I mean, I think the city can do those kinds of things unless, Paul, you tell me no, but I don't see why we can't. And that could go a ways to promoting weatherization, et cetera. Now, CBOEO will do it for free. I mean, they're underwritten, as we all saw on that wonderful workshop that the Energy Committee put together. Their problem is manpower. They have a hard time finding staff and paying them enough money to do this. This is hard work. And if we're going to ramp up and say we really want a lot of weatherization done, we're going to need to think about a training program. Or somebody's going to have to do a training program because they don't have enough for what they're doing now. And we want to quadruple it, more than that. So those are just some, I think that there's a lot of good stuff in here. So I'm pretty happy. I would love to hear more from Srini, and I'd love to have a copy of his documents, because I'm more of a reader than an audible learner. So that's enough. I'll cede my time to Srini.
Thank you. And Srini, if it's okay with you, I think that's a good idea to circulate that around so that people can get some ideas about what that feedback looks like. So if that's okay, or Srini, if you want to do a revised one after this, that's fine.
Maybe I can do a revised one. I just realized that it's in the wrong buckets.
Oh.
So
Yeah. All right.
I can do a revised one. So okay.
Well, let me take a couple minutes here to give you my thoughts, and then we can move on to some more detailed discussion about the individual items. So I rather than thinking about the specific items, I wanted to have everyone think about the city's unique position and strengths and what role is most beneficial for the city as an entity to play in this. We're in this landscape of, we've got the federal and state actors, we've got nonprofit organizations, Efficiency Vermont, and the other energy and efficiency utilities. We've got lots of different players in the landscape, including we've also got the businesses and the homeowners who are going to have to do a lot of these things, right? Everyone is going to have to play a role in it. And I think it's really helpful to try to identify which are the spots in this whole system, right? If we imagine what a successful outcome looks like with everyone playing their role, what is the role that the city needs to play to make that all go better than it would otherwise, right? And so let's find where those spots are. And I think I probably don't know as much about all the things that the city can do, but I have observed that there's sort of two different buckets that we can look at, right? So there's hard power and soft power that the city has. So the hard power is particularly uniquely the cities, although there's some overlap with the state in terms of taxation, regulations, and policies around, zoning or fuels or parking or lots of things like that, right? So there's some hard power that the city has to actually make rules that can be enforced. They have financial implications or implications that prevent you from selling a building or doing other things like that, right? And then
Right.
there's soft power, which is information. And in some ways, the information can be one of the most powerful things that we have in the system, particularly if we're trying to amplify the actions of some of the other players like CVOEO or the efficiency groups, or to engage and activate the residents and businesses in the town. And the city has a uniquely trusted voice in all of this, right? The city's not making a buck on any of this. And presumably the city is looking out for the benefit of everyone who lives and works here. So I think that if we are very thoughtful about what are our strongest assets and what are the key challenges, right? We've talked about some of these, about workforce, about information and education. And, so trying to figure out, okay, what are the biggest gaps that our skills as a city, that our assets as a city can fill in? There's a lot of things we could put on this list that need to get done, but maybe don't need to get done by us as a city, or maybe are not best done by us. That's what I think is going to be most helpful for us to focus on a short list that is best suited to our skills. So,
Ethan, can I add one thing to that? I think that's a really interesting way to look at it. I would add one more role of the cities, which is we have some limited financial capacity of our own, but often our biggest thing that we can do is we are eligible for oftentimes
Grants.
pretty significant grants. Our stormwater utility
Right.
for more than a decade has been pulling in millions and millions of dollars to help with water quality.
Yep.
So think of that model from the energy side of what could be done as those become available. So that's a role that is, obviously the funds come from, say, the federal government, but there is a very specific city role that is often, not always uniquely ours, but often uniquely ours.
I suspect there's some other things in that category where the city can bond to put up collateral for, loans to get better rates or things like that. And I don't know all the details of it, but I think that's a great point. And maybe Paul, if you have some recommendations on where we can go to look for, or how you could help us understand what some of the city's strengths are, not right this second, but yeah, Donna.
I think one of the things that shouldn't be overlooked is that the cities of South Burlington has some considerable political power. One of the things that the Vermont Climate Council came up with, and it seemed as though Vermont Green Mountain Power was willing to go along with it as long as they didn't actually have to borrow the money, was and it could be a very, very helpful tool in terms of paying for weatherization for those people who can afford it, was on-bill financing. Because paying for this is, I mean, it's not the entire problem, but it's a big piece of the problem. And on-bill financing is something that Green Mountain Power is willing to do. But I think there's some political pressure needed to get legislators or whoever, I don't know how that happens.
There's actually a pilot that's happening now, that's spooling up right now, and there's some funding that's coming from the federal recovery money that's going to seed that. So it's a great observation. I think there is actually some motion there. It'd be interesting to see how we could help.
Yeah, and along with the, sort of the grants idea, pilot programs, like trying to get access to, be the first one. If it hasn't been done before, you're going to have a little more growing pains, but you might get some resources that that other people may not have as much access to.
So any other sort of follow-up comments or answers to questions, Melanie, if you wanted to respond to some of the things that you heard that that people had asked questions about, or just filling in some information for us before we move on to specific actions.
Sure. I took some really good notes. Thanks everybody for your comments. We will do another iteration of this to incorporate what you said. Some really good ideas in here. I think the first question was from Andrew about the clean heat standard and a lot of the proposed legislation that is happening now as a result of the climate action plan. I guess so. My answer is I've had the same thought, Andrew. And it seems to me it's too soon to tell. I mean, I think a lot of the work that this state is doing with the clean heat standard, it's very early, and the clean heat stand proposal, I think, is not going to be ready until January 2023. And then also the work that the state is doing with modifying the energy code to be net zero by 2023. I think that will get the city part of the way there. And I've been thinking about a way to model this to better understand what the city has to do to go above and beyond that in a more focused, earlier action. And so that might come into play in what our business as usual scenario is in the modeling. So what policies are we going to model? So I don't have a good answer for you, but I mean, the legislation is coming to help move the state in that direction.
I didn't realize the state was accelerating net zero to 2023, so that's also really helpful.
Yeah, and so I mean, in my mind, I'm thinking that we'll do some work to model what level that gets us there, and the state has done that modeling as well. So they've done energy analysis to see how doing the energy code to net zero at 2020 or 2030 is going to get them to meet the goals.
Yeah. Melanie, one of the things you really have to watch out for is that the state as a state entity is not willing to enforce the energy code. So having a code that says you need net zero, like right now in 2020, the code adopted a much higher R value requirement for exterior walls. And literally they think that way under 50% of home builders are actually doing that right now. That is the code. It has been the code for a year, more than a year, and the builders are not doing it. And so that's one of the things that South Burlington is going to have to really consider. And perhaps the regional planning commissions have to have a role in this too. I'm not sure, because the governor has been pretty specific. The head of the Vermont Public Service Department wants to have nothing to do with enforcing a code for residential. They have some more leeway on commercial buildings, but that's only on commercial buildings that are designed by architects and engineers. Those that are built by design build firms, basically, if they sign off on it, you don't really know whether they're meeting the code or not. So if South Burlington is serious, or as Burlington is, they have code enforcement. They have a Burlington code enforcement officer, and they work in conjunction with Vermont, with Burlington Electric. It's really impossible to state with any certainty that a code is going to be make a difference unless it's enforced.
Good point.
One thing I hear in there that I think is really useful to think about or framing for a lot of these is the question about whether this is a problem that we only need to solve in South Burlington, or if we can solve it in South Burlington, and or whether advocacy at the regional advocacy and collaboration at the regional and statewide level would give even more impact, because we are one of the larger cities in the state.
Right.
So I think that's a useful frame to bring to a lot of these is, for example, I brought up with the, head of A&R about like, oh, what does it take for us to be able to enact a gas ban? And she said, well, why don't you work with the state and try to solve this for all the towns instead of just trying to come up with a solution for Burlington and South Burlington and like everyone individually. And I think that's sort of an open question that we don't necessarily need to solve it at this phase of it, but I think that is a really important question with each one of these of, okay, this is something we want to solve. What is our role in solving it?
Right.
So I just want to let you know that we are, as a regional planning commission, we have given this feedback to the public service department. We feel like the energy code is a state code and it should be enforced by the state. I am with a woman at the public service department who is looking into our comments. Hopefully she'll take them seriously and get back to us. But no, Donna, we're well aware of that. We're totally on board with everything you're saying. We just don't know if the state is going to pick this up and run with it at any point. So, it is an option for the city of South Burlington to do what Burlington has done, which is to adopt its own building code and do its own enforcement.
Oh, we have the code. I mean, the code is a good code.
But it's a state code. You can't enforce a state code.
Ah,
Can I, I'm afraid we're going a little too deep on this topic. Maybe not by design, although it's an important topic. So Melanie, were there any other specific things that you wanted to address before we sort of dive into trying to tackle individual actions? Because I was going to propose a process for trying to do that, but I don't want to cut you off if you had other responses.
Yeah, I mean, the other question that I wrote down is whether the city has the authority to require audits. And to me, like, that's still a question. I don't know. And that's something that we can research. And shaking her head, it would probably be in the realm of building codes, maybe, but it's still a question.
And I would harken back. I think when we've talked about this earlier, the suggestion had been if we have actions that we think have value, but we don't know whether we have authority or what it would need to get authority, that we not get hung up on that question before we make a decision about, is it something we want to pursue? And then we can go back and say, do we think we can get there?
Yeah.
And I like that comment, and I like it also as it relates to the prior one of, I don't know whether the most effective way to go about, say, building codes is to bring up a South Burlington system, or to take what Anna said that the RPCs are doing and push the Vermont League of Cities and Towns and then our legislators and everybody to really make a big push at the state. There's one thing to make, it's great that the RPCs made a comment and made feedback, but is this something that our time would be better spent building our own structure or really making a big push on it? And I think that's something to say the subject area is one critical. We can dive further into that action at a later time about what's the way to get it.
And Paul, the way you're framing that, I think, is also making me think that there are some of these questions about like, what's the best way to, like, we've identified an outcome we want, we've identified an obstacle or a question we need to answer, and we don't have the expertise in this group to know like what's the best political strategy or what are all the laws surrounding this. And I think that sometimes rather than getting bogged down and hypothesizing or trying to do our own research and become experts, that there are probably some places where we just acknowledge we need to get expertise and we need to ask, is the city lawyer able to help with us? Are there other folks who can help with sort of statewide lobbying strategy and things like that, right? So if we frame the questions, we don't necessarily have to answer all of them. At least from my perspective, I think we'll get better outcomes if we tap on those experts. So
yeah, and I would just add it quickly, Ethan, that to me is also evidence that this climate action plan will be a living document. It's not a once and done. Oftentimes something that either we start or the state starts, things change. Maybe in 4 years' time, who knows, maybe the state's energy code will require a EV parking spot for every single for every single unit, and then we don't have to take that on anymore. Or maybe, we put it in and then we can take it out of our own local regulations, that kind of thing. It's a living document, and that's great.
So can I suggest that we move into a little more detail around some of these actions? And so before we dive in, my suggestion is that we take an individual action to start with. We said we wanted to explore it, and specifically try to look at what information we have currently in the document and discuss, do we have enough information about this action? What other information do we need? Let's not try to make a decision about each action or get into a debate, arguing pro and con, but
Right.
let's just really try to get to, maybe we actually can move through a number of these from this framing. But I would really encourage us to try really hard. I'm speaking to myself here too, because I have a lot of opinions about stuff that's on here, but to simply look and say, do we have enough information for this item to be on here, or are there missing pieces of information? Can we fill them in right now, or do we need to make a note that this is what we're missing about this? Like, we don't know laws, we don't know who else is working on this, we don't know how big the impact is, whatever it might be. Let's just try to identify, do we feel like this action is done? Is it fully expressed on the sheet? And that seems to me like the goal of this first pass through, right? That we have all the actions that we want, and that each action has enough information that we'll be able to move on to the next step of prioritizing actions. Does everyone feel like that's a next step that they're on board with?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Would anyone like to propose an action that they think is, a really important one, a really confusing one, a really clear one? Is there one action that people are jonesing to talk about? Again, not necessarily to advocate for or tear down, but to ask questions about the content or offer more content to complete the information on that row. Any proposals?
Well, I'd like to comment on this row 21. I don't think, well, the educational efforts, I think, have to be very specifically targeted at the high users. The general education outreach is not effective.
So can I just stop you, Donna? Because tell me if I'm incorrect about this. That sounds a lot more like an opinion and less about information. Or can you frame that as information that's missing from this, or information that needs to be added to this?
I think it needs to be kind of reconsidered. Reconsidered in its entirety. And perhaps even broken up into several different efforts targeted at specific target groups.
Okay, so this action you think needs to be more fine-grained,
Yes.
before we can make decisions about it or gather information about it. Okay, that's a useful feedback.
Yeah,
I completely agree with Don. It's kind of similar to what I was saying. It should be outreach to high energy users, right?
Well, again, let's not advocate for what the right answer is. Let's just, do we want to break it up and say there's advocacy for low income, advocacy for high income?
I guess I'm not understanding how you're framing. I thought we were going through each of these actions. What's your framing of the exercise?
Before we try to decide whether each one of these actions should or shouldn't be approved and included in the plan, I want to see if we can go through the exercise of trying to make sure that everyone feels like they have enough information about that action, that it is an action that they would be prepared to vote up or down on.
But why are we talking about actions which we don't agree are framed correctly? I mean, shouldn't we first agree this is the right action and then go through that exercise?
So we want to make a decision about whether we like the action before we know what it is?
No, I'm just, look, I mean, this is a little recursive, but if this action could be improved, right, then shouldn't we try to do that?
I'm open to that. I'm just a little concerned that if I just want to keep focused and not get too down in the weeds on it. So if there's information you think it needs more detail before we can make a decision on it, like what it would entail, that seems totally fair. I don't want to be draconian here. I'm just afraid this is going to get into sort of a mud wrestling, and we're not going to get anywhere productively through the list.
So
Can it
can I
be
suggest,
rewritten?
maybe line 21 was a hard one to start with because it is such a precise statement that I think is
Exactly.
fairly well like framed already. Whereas let's say line 23, maybe not everybody understands what that program is. Is that sort of what you were trying to get at, Ethan? Like, does everybody know what that is before we say it's a good idea or not? I think line 21, 2 education sessions per year is a known thing. It may not be the right thing, but it's fairly self-evident.
Right.
Is that
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah, that's great.
So
And so
maybe if somebody has a question, is there something that they don't understand? Is that maybe the way to frame that, or something where it's just like one of these items, it's not clear to you what is the intent of it?
Yeah.
sure.
So,
Srini?
to add to that, Paul, if I take 22, I'm not going to touch 21 now. If I take 22, the way the action is stated today, to me, it's very passive. It talks about holding a workshop annually to do walkthroughs
Yeah,
and encourage energy efficiency. It's very, very passive. There is no bite or there is no meat to it. So, whereas if you remember what I was trying to say about, we need to figure out a way to accelerate or jumpstart energy audits and figure out a way to make, maybe, lead progress versus the rest of the state so that you can actually identify what can be done. And could you come up with a policy around it? Could you figure out a way to dedicate resource around it? Could you provide the right expertise? So to me, the way it is stated today, it is very passive. I'm not exactly sure what we would do with it.
Can I build on that, Srini, and
Yeah.
maybe supporting what you're saying? So the problem that I see with the way that it's framed right now in terms of being very vague and passive is that I don't have a clear sense when I read that about what is what are those workshops going to improve?
Yeah.
And how is that going to lead to some more energy savings?
exactly.
Right. And so that's what's missing for me in terms of being able to vote up or down on that one is what sort of information are those workshops going to entail, to what audience, and what evidence do we have that that information is the missing element to getting more actions done?
Right.
And I just would frame that again as like that. I think that's information that we would need to add in order to get this action more clearly done. So I don't want to do a whole research project on it, but maybe if we can find some way to draw out that it's solving a problem.
Because if you look at the metric is talking about number of events. I mean, we can't pat ourselves on our back by holding number of workshops.
Exactly.
Right? So you need to have a more binding metric that forces you to take the action and follow through with the appropriate steps. So to me, this sounds more like a marketing campaign than the city actually actively doing something. I mean, I think we need to help the city council to think differently than what the rest of Vermont is doing. And the way I would think about it this differently is, have a stake in the plan, be part of the process where you're actually doing the audit and identifying opportunities instead of passing it on to a different agency.
So there's three things. Sorry, Melanie, go ahead.
This may be an oversimplification question, but I've heard numerous times throughout this meeting about educational actions. And I know you guys already have a very robust energy committee that is doing a lot of this educational work. And so it would be helpful to hear whether the action should not we shouldn't have any educational actions, because as written, this is the level of specificity that we can get at. And if you guys want to focus on more actionable, policy-oriented, capital improvement type stuff, then maybe we focus more of our energy there.
Well,
And it's something to think about. It's a question that I have in my mind.
Melanie, I don't think that's what we're saying. I think what we're saying is that a workshop is too passive in that, you know, somebody has to make a decision to go to the workshop. You know, what you need is, you have been identified as a high energy user. This is what you need to do, you know, to remedy the situation. This is the assistance that can be provided to get you through this. This is, you know, this is how we're going to get you to where you need to be. It
Donna,
needs to be more focused in that way. So it's still
Okay.
educational, but it's focused on individuals, not general. I mean, it's like, we're to the point now, we've been doing general for 30 years. And you have to be really pointed and say, this is what, you know, this is needed.
Yeah, so, you know, back to something I was saying earlier in the meeting today, one of the things that I'm viewing and that I'm having a challenge with here is that some of the actions are hyper specific. Hold one workshop per year to do this.
Exactly.
Some of them are develop a program to, you know, the next line down and the one after that to, you know, to do things that will have, you know, hundreds of homes over time. I would recommend that for something like line 22, we talk about what level of investment in education we do. Because over the life of this plan, what exactly we do to do it is going to differ. It's not about a workshop. It's about how much emphasis we put on education and all the ways that we can do it ourselves and partner with others, whether it's, you know, Facebook posts or it's workshops or it's, you know, signs out in the community or whatever we're doing.
So that's a great point, Paul. I have sort of three specific questions around that one, and it probably falls on some of the other education ones. So the first question is, what is the educational outcome supposed to improve, right? What change is this making? And just to try to put a point on, even if we're describing generally that we want an educational policy, is it making people aware that things exist or the value is, or, you know, why climate change matters or something like that? Like figure out, try to describe like, what is the educational outcome we're trying to get to? And then the two other things are, you know, who are we trying to reach? And I don't have a strong opinion about exactly how fine-grained that is, you know, like multifamily apartment dwellers with incomes between $55,000 and $56,000 a year. Like I don't need to get super fine-grained on it, but I think it would be good to know, like, and I think this applies to even non-educational ones. Who is it that the city is trying to influence through this? And then the third one that I think would be useful is, who are the other partners that are involved, right? We have a column that is who within the city is doing this, but a bunch of the things in here, I feel like our conversations come back to, well, who else is working on this? Who do we need to work with? Who might help us? Or who could we instead be supporting? Who would actually be the actor who would get this done? So those are the three things that I would say. I don't know if those three categories apply to everything on here or a subset, but, and I don't want to try to answer all those questions right now, but I would point out that I think those three pieces of information for me are lacking before I feel like I could say, oh, this is awesome. That's a really important idea. Or, yeah, I don't think that's going to go anywhere. Do we want to try to tap on another one, or if people don't have other burning comments? I don't know that we're going to like check each one of these off the list as done, but I think it's good to try some different types of ones to figure out like what categories of things are missing. Do we want to get away, do a non-educational one?
Getting into the implementation details before we agree that these actions make sense at a high level? I don't know.
But I'm not describing getting into the implementation details. I'm just saying what outcome
partner with, and it feels like those are, I don't know. It just feels like we should back up and make sure that we agree that these actions make sense before fleshing out all these questions with respect to them.
Well, let me tell you why I think it's important to know who else is out there doing this, because some of these things may sound like new and necessary to me, but if we went and looked out there and said, actually,
I don't disagree. It is important. I agree, but I guess I'm just questioning the order here. But
I guess the reason why I think that it would be helpful before we try to make a decision about whether we want this to be part of South Burlington's plan is if we did some research and said, CVOEO is running 6 workshops a year. 4 of them are in the, close driving distance from Chittenden County. Efficiency Vermont runs another 25, and here's how many are close by, and we've identified 30 other workshops. This action might totally change to help promote the existing workshops that are going on rather than add more workshops out there. And so, and if on the other hand, it's like no one's doing workshops, and that is a really important thing, then I would feel totally different about it. So I don't know. I mean, maybe it's too much work to get there, but I guess I'm concerned that we would put something on here and say, oh, this is a great idea, we totally support it. Then we vote on it. It's on our short list. We go into the detailed analysis and implementation plan. And at that point, discover that someone else has got this totally nailed. We have nothing to add.
Can I suggest that, I think we're almost talking about the same thing, but just from different angles. I think that what I'm hearing from some folks is that, it's already in the weeds, and from other folks that we need more information. I'm wondering if reframing all of the educational ones as being, find the city's niche areas where we have where we can make a difference in education, and do that, and have that be the action that takes over all of the actions on education. And then later, we can agree or not agree that that's a good thing to do, and then figure out what that is later. Just as a thought, is education in an area where we have an expertise useful or not useful, but not not be quite as much in the details of it.
That would certainly help avoid the need for more research if we frame it more broadly.
Because then I think it's more at the level of some of the other ones, and then we can, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole here, but one thing that pops into my mind is an area of education that we might have a role in that very few others do, is we have a relationship with some of the large landowners or the large building owners that maybe we can connect them to CVOE, or we can connect them to others that others don't have that ability to do. And it's not about holding a workshop, it's about using our area of expertise. So just a thought of but I don't want to go into that detail. I just want to say, take our areas of expertise as education and connection building.
I think that's helpful. I might still advocate for at least trying to describe at a high or abstract level what is the intended outcome, what do we hope to accomplish from this, to be able to describe that the city has a particularly trusted voice or has unique audiences with some of these folks or something like that, to be able to describe and maybe that can be embedded in the description and doesn't need a separate column, but I think it would be helpful to try to explain what we think we're going to get out of it.
Okay, well, let's put that as the homework item, as how to flesh that out a little further.
Okay. Do we want to try to tackle a non-educational item and see how those work?
We go back to talking about G, though, Srini's point. What's the right metric? Should it be something like number of energy audits conducted or something like that? For that item?
Are you back on the?
Where are you?
I'm on the same item,
which
22.
Oh, okay.
Item 22, the workshops. Well, if we're going to reframe that more broadly as a group of educational things, should we wait until that's articulated to try to describe what it is? I would also say that from my perspective, defining what impact we're going to have is really helpful to define what metric we're going to use to track it.
And I would just like to say that education is a harder one. I mean, I think we ought to agree on a whole bunch of really good stuff here, like net zero and requirements for new buildings and weatherization. And, those are very practical kinds of things that we ought to be able to come up with a good target for. Then we may say, the only way this is going to get adopted everywhere is we educate all the builders and we have a conference for them, or we educate this. But I don't I think that's kind of the last step after you figured out what's the change I want to make and who do we need to educate about that change. And it could be technical education that's, you know, it could be all kinds of things, but education of it, I can tell you as somebody in public health planning and evaluation, education is the place where you really just go nowhere. Everybody wants to do it in public health and they haven't a clue what they think they're going to get accomplished. So that's the last thing I think we want to design personally.
Lynn, do you have a recommendation then on something that's more concrete on this list that we could?
I think there are lots of concrete things on it.
Did you pick one?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, for new housing.
Which line?
27. Establish and adopt a building code pursuant to Title 24, you know, that the city can make rules. That the city has authority to regulate the thermal fuel source of new buildings. I think that's very specific. It's a good one. We're pretty sure the city can do it, but we can get a legal opinion because we impose all kinds of things. That's very specific.
Does anyone have, so on that one, does anyone have either questions about information that they think is missing to be able to make decisions about that, or suggestions about information that they would like to add to it? Srini?
I have suggestions. So the suggestions I have are the following. Instead of just setting, you know, what I call as a definitive goal, saying that 100% of the buildings need to be net zero by X date, maybe set a vision for a 10-year, 20-year plan to have X% of new build as net zero homes. Not say that 100% it needs to be 100%.
Okay.
Maybe X% needs to be net zero homes. The reason I say that is chances are that the 100% requirement, you know, may not go in for a long time. But if you incorporate the concept of we need to achieve this target, and you know, maybe we can incentivize people to get to the target faster versus saying everyone is going to do it. So that's why I think having a flexible goal or a 10 or 20-year vision would be helpful. The second suggestion I have is consider hiring a city-level resource to educate and promote net zero building standards with builders and contractors. So every time a permit comes in, there will be a city resource that will go through a process of education or awareness campaign with the specific builder or contractor to figure out, you know, whether they will jump to the next level of hurdle to look at it, to look at requirements for net zero buildings, and they will adopt that. The next one I have is develop and implement a sustainable audit plan. You know, okay, you've asked people to implement net zero, people who agree, have they done it? You know, go and figure out a way to have an audit plan. And then I have one more, something around, oh yeah, maybe the city can provide specific incentives to builders to operate in South Burlington if they're willing to build more net zero homes. Maybe there is some business incentive that can be provided.
Sure. You could waive some of the fees. I mean, they love that if you waive fees for them for the first 100 that are built or something. I don't know. But
Can I ask a couple questions here? Maybe this is pointed more at Melanie and Ann, because I think there's some really interesting points and good ideas to include on the list. But I know there's a next phase to come after in terms of creating implementation plans, and so I think this may come up in some of the other items as well. Where, so one of the things that Srini was offering to this was to get more detailed about the, you know, specific actions that have to happen within this sort of broader goal. And so my question is, do you have any feedback about the granularity we should be going here, right? Education, we needed to sort of bring it up to this one, you know, how do we find that right level? So that's one question that I hear coming out of Srini's discussion. And the other one is about the intermediary goals. So a bunch of these things are expressed in terms of this is where the end goal is, right? And we know that our goals actually have 2025, 2030, 20, I forget exactly which benchmarks we have along the way. At what point in the process should we be trying to connect to the you know, the intermediary goals and not just the ultimate goal? So again, this is just like a general question, like what's the best way for us to try to get these things all into the same type of buckets so that we can compare them?
So I think the milestone markers could be either in 5-year or 10-year increments, depending upon the state goals. We could go off of those, but those also switch depending upon what sector there's in. There's not a clear like 5, 10, 15-year milestone that goes along with the CEP goals. And it also really depends on the feasibility of the action and how specific we get the action down to, and what's feasible in a 10-year time frame or a 20-year time frame.
So is the work to articulate those, I mean, they don't all have to be on the same time schedule and things like that. I don't know that we need to be that rigid about it, but is the work to try to articulate that sort of multi-step goal something that we should be doing now in this action list, or something that we should be doing during the implementation phase after we've selected one of these goals?
I think from a workflow perspective, let's get the action on the table and then figure out what is feasible for achieving the incremental progress.
Okay.
And then your other question, it was about the level of specificity. I think that the committee indicated that the level of specificity for the action on line 27 was a good level, because it identifies what, it identifies who. And so I think that if we can achieve that with all of the goals or actions, then I think we're providing a good foundation to get the implementation plan developed.
But we're not doing the implementation plan. That's the next.
We're not, right. So it would be specific enough to inform the implementation plan, but not too specific that it takes up all of the resources to do the research in figuring out what the action is going to be. So it's going to be,
Right.
you know, a delicate balance.
Right.
But what I'm envisioning there, just to reflect back and see if this is fair, is that the actions that we define here are specific enough that if the implementation plan comes back and says, here's how we propose to do the implementation, that we can look at the action and say that does or doesn't meet the request in this action, right? If it's like super vague, like create an education program, well, it's going to be up to a lot of interpretation, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be down to like, you're going to create a 14-page document that blah, 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 right? So I think that's how I think of what you're saying is fill in the details. Srini,
Yeah, I mean, I think for the education actions, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
if you want to respond, what, Eleni?
Oh, I'm like, for the education actions, I'm hearing that we need to be more specific about education around audits and education around the energy code for developers. So being more specific about what we are trying to educate people about and what change we want them to make. So I think we can definitely get there.
I sort of agree with Darylyn that maybe the education is in service of all the other things. That it's like, I would really encourage us to maybe not talk about the education one yet, because it's just the
Yes.
hardest one to explain. So like, let's talk about the action ones. And then I really like Darylyn's approach to that.
Yeah. So I was just going to say that 27 the way the action was written, as Melanie mentioned, was very, very specific, right? It's about adopting a building code, right, to regulate thermal source of new buildings. This is something that is probably easy to put a lot of supporting actions around it and decide whether South Burlington needs to be a leader in this regard or that South Burlington needs to be a laggard. What I mean by that is, it waits for the state to do something and then we take action. So if we decide that, if we prioritize based on what Andrew was suggesting, if we put this as a high priority, we will put a lot of media actions around it to make it very appealing and maybe worthwhile for the city council to consider and charter a team to go and figure out an implementation plan. So some of these things will lend itself to more meaty specific actions, I think, even without scoping out a project, but some of the other ones require the help of other agencies to figure out, what exactly needs to be done. I think this one is fairly straightforward, I think.
I'm not sure it is. I gotta tell you, I mean, based upon what I observed Burlington going through to try and accomplish this, I think it's more than a legal opinion. I think it's probably spelling out the process that needs to happen in order to enable this. I'm not sure it's simple.
No, what I mean by, Andrew, is specifying net zero standard in buildings is pretty much across all the climate action plans I have read so far, all the major cities. I've reviewed about 6 of them so far. This one is there in almost every climate action plan.
It's an easy sell. I'm just saying, as the action is drafted here, and I am like a strong proponent of this action, it seems to me we probably need more than a legal opinion. I think my observation is this is actually a hard one with a low feasibility, and it would be good to understand what exactly needs to happen to enable this action.
All I'm saying, Andrew, is if the rest of the world is pursuing this, there is a lot to learn and leverage. That's all I'm saying. A lot of cities seem to be pursuing this very actively. So,
Right.
So
I think you're all
actually-
saying the same thing. I think it's sort of in response to the note that was written in red there. Legal opinion is one of, oops, it just got dark in here. One of 40 things that need to be done to get to this piece. And I think that's a good place to leave this one. I would encourage, as sort of related to this one and 28, that maybe an action that Srini pointed out that I think is valuable is set a plan for how to get to net zero or whatever percentage we're going for over 10 years. That's an action in and of itself. Incentives, regulations, like what's I don't want to call it, I guess it's incremental, but a plan for how to get there using these tools once adopted, I think is a separate action.
Well, just on that, I can tell you my perspective, and I'd be interested in others, is that we shouldn't be adding to the problem. New buildings should be net zero if we have the technology to do it. I don't understand why we'd phase that in. I can understand phasing in existing buildings, but new buildings, why would we be adding to our greenhouse gas problem if we establish, why should we let one builder build something that's not net zero and next door build something that is? That doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, I think when we get into the details of these, there's questions when someone comes to the city and says, your policy is causing another $50,000 in this project and I refuse to do it. And then is there a follow-up where we go and put a lock on the door and say, you do not have a certificate of occupancy. You've built a building that we will not allow you to occupy, because it's fine for us to put stuff on the spreadsheet, but the level of detail of like what are the enforcement mechanisms and what are the surrounding policies.
And there are all sorts of fines. There are fines and fees. There's all sorts of fees which you could waive to the person who's going to build net zero.
And Ethan, you and I know that person is not realistically going to say that. We've done enough research to know that you can build net zero at equivalent price to other homes. We know that.
Right.
I don't know why anyone's not building it today. So I agree with you. But
We have to draft these actions against, what we know, right? Not,
Yeah, I just look at things like the firing range down in southern Vermont that violated all sorts of very clear laws. And
Right.
things are getting dragged out through court and police and all sorts. And I realize that's an extreme case. So I'm just saying, like, it's sort of helpful to get down to the level of detail of what mechanisms are we asking the city to put in place. So I think we're probably getting too much in the weeds on this.
Yeah, I would say that I think a valuable thing for you to, as a task force, to think about over the next little while is at the level of policy. Andrew has made the recommendation that we, as soon as we can develop the tools, that we go to, let's get all homes being net zero. And I'm sorry if I'm getting Srini or Darrellin wrong, but one of you suggested potentially a phase-in approach over time.
Srini.
That's a good policy question, maybe not for tonight, but for you all to, what is going to be the recommendation to the council? Once we have the tools in place, to try to get everybody immediately or to phase it in. And I don't want to weigh in on it tonight, but I think that is exactly where this task force can weigh in.
Good way to frame it. Yep.
Yeah, it sounds like that's a question we need to get more information on, or that people need to discuss further. Looking at the time, I want to ask if we'd be willing to move on, or suggest that we move on for this meeting from the process of going down through the items, and make sure that we tick off a few of the other things that are on the agenda before everyone turns into pumpkins here. And I mean, we could talk about this stuff all night, and I'm not sure we'll solve it all. And I also suspect that the feedback that we've already given to Melanie and Ann about how to refine some of these, it's probably a good point to go and cycle on this.
Can I make one more point about line 28, because I think Paul referenced it. I think it seems to me we should break that action up. There's one to charge a fee, and there's a second to figure out what to do with the revenue. And I don't know why we're mixing those two, or connecting those two in the way it is connected here, because you could see lots of different ways to use that revenue. For instance, just lower taxes or other things.
So Andrew, why don't I make a suggestion that we can actually continue to work on this stuff individually, and Melanie or Ann, have you shared the spreadsheet version of this worksheet with the entire task force yet, or just with me and Andrew?
I believe I sent it out to everybody.
Okay, great.
Late last week, yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm going to suggest, or specifically request, that to the extent that folks can find time before the next meeting, and maybe even target to get your feedback on these finished by, like, say, a week ahead of the next meeting, so that it can be compiled and folks can review it. I don't know whether it makes most sense for Melanie and Ann to do the compilation, or whether we send everything to everyone. What I don't think we want to do is everyone individually send all your comments to everyone, and it then becomes sort of a daisy chain document problem. And it's just not necessarily the most productive way to make progress here. So if everyone can, and maybe just stick with buildings and thermal for now. Do we need to move on to, because I feel like we
No, let's do this. One more.
Yeah,
sorry.
Is Melanie going to send us this updated without as many columns, and including all of the feedback that we've given today? Is this going to be updated before we have a chance to before we review it again?
So yes, we can send you a shrink down worksheet that's just buildings and thermal with the columns that are relevant. And I guess it's up to you as a group. I've been taking a lot of notes. We can edit the worksheet according to the information that we heard today, or we could give you one more week to go through this, and then with the information that we heard today, and then the information that you're going to give us at the end of next week, we could provide you another draft.
So two questions that I would ask is, one, just about timing. If we wanted to wait for you to reflect the comments you've heard tonight onto a new draft of it, when do you think, reasonably you would be ready to send that back? Do we have enough time for you to do that iteration, for us to send comments back and then have a week before the next meeting? Or is that is that not realistic? And we should just keep going and say, this is the process of the task force giving you comments, and we're going to keep providing it on the content that's there now.
I think it would be ideal if you just kept giving us comments. I don't think we're going to be able to do that fast turnaround in time for you to have time to do your work and then get it back to us so that we can do more work and then get it into the packet.
Okay, so sounds like you'll update the formatting to make it easier for everyone to use. Send us that clean copy with basically the same content that's here today, but new format. And then everyone can continue doing the kind of feedback that we're providing now. And I don't think we're going to be too rigid about like how you provide that feedback. So if you want to add your own columns for your notes, or just make sure that it's clear what things you've edited so that people don't have to try to like compare between the original one and this one to know what your feedback is, because there's no track changes on Excel.
Yeah, and can each sector be a separate worksheet too?
Absolutely. Is it fair to put a deadline on this to give us time to turn around the content? So have additional comments in by end of next week. I guess the 18th at the very latest.
When do you think you'll get the updated format?
We can send you the updated format tomorrow.
Great. Okay. Yeah, I think it's good if people have a weekend in case they find that easier to work on this. Is that, how does everyone else on the committee feel? Is that enough time by the end of next week to get back with comments? It's probably better to do it while it's fresh anyway, right? Good.
Yes.
Okay. Fantastic. Well, we knew this wasn't going to be easy, but I feel like that was productive and we got into multiple levels there. So thank you everyone for all the effort there. Last couple things on the agenda. Paul, you said you had something else you wanted to bring up. Is that during other business you want to?
I can just talk about it now. Two quick things that I think are of relevance to folks. One is, as you probably all know, the city has been awarded, as has every community, some level of the recovery, the ARPA funds, the American Recovery Act funds.
Right.
There is some discretion as to how the city will be able to use that. And this is sort of a once in a generation or more opportunity. Our city manager is going to begin the discussion with our city council about the structure of how do they want to think about this at their next meeting on February 22nd. So I just want to give you a little heads up that that's coming, and a component of that is very much related to everything you're talking about tonight. Second thing, I'm sure you've probably already seen the news, but the city council adopted a set of amendments to the land development regulations on Monday night. It has some very directly energy and climate change related things in there, specifically requiring solar ready roofs on commercial buildings, specifically making it easier to do solar canopies in surface parking lots, and then a number of indirect, but certainly very closely related to climate change subjects like habitat blocks, like resiliency in terms of regulating the 500-year floodplain and not just the 100-year floodplain. Happy to go into this in more detail if folks would like, but I just wanted to note that a significant action took place this week related to your work.
Thank you. Roseanne, did you want to add to that?
I didn't want to add to that, but I wanted to make a comment before, just a general comment from somebody in the peanut gallery listening to what you're doing.
Sure.
Is now the time?
I
I didn't know if Ethan or Paul had more comments. I don't want to interrupt the
have any more
flow.
structured comments. We need to approve the minutes. I don't know if there's anything else on the agenda that has to happen besides.
I want to talk for 1 minute about the equity thing. We never talk about that. We put it on an agenda and then we don't get to it because there's so much else.
Well, why don't you bring that up now, and then Roseanne will entertain your feedback as well. So
okay,
Geraldine?
It's just, if you look at the equity stuff, as you probably did, one of the things that they stress is that the people who will be most affected by it, the people who have been most harmed by what's been happening, et cetera, are part of the planning. And we're not doing any of that. So if you're thinking that that can come in at the implementation stage after we have set the goals, then I'm just mentioning that. You know what I'm saying, everybody? If you look at what it says for the equity and the way you rate your project, etc., it says proposed effects. Oh, the proposal reflects the inclusion of frontline impacted communities in design and implementation. So that's a moving target. We could say we're working up at this high level and it doesn't matter, but I just think if we're going to talk about the standards, we really have to recognize that point. That's from the get-go. That's what they're saying. Okay, that's
Thank
all.
you. Thank you for bringing that up, because I think that's very timely. That reminds me that when I went back and looked at the original project schedule that had been proposed, February 10th is the beginning of the public input period as described on that schedule.
Oh my
We
God.
haven't talked about that in any detail, so I don't know exactly what that entails and how we plan to do outreach and how we're asking for that input. But it seems like that some of the missing input from those frontline communities and other underserved communities that are part of our equity goals should be considered as we roll that out. And we're going to roll that out now. So, but I don't know what's Melanie.
Let
or
me
Paul?
follow up via email to folks. Our vision was that for the next couple of months, while you're developing these, what you're doing right now, these pathways and actions, is we would start to get broad feedback on what are other people's ideas for pathways and actions. So it doesn't specifically need the committee, although I hear exactly what Darylyn is saying, and that part of it, certainly, how do we integrate that from the very beginning? But in terms of broad outreach, this was going to be sort of a staff piece. When you get to the next stage of you've got a set that you'd like to try, there's going to be more formal outreach to say, here's our top 20, what do you think? And have you be the sort of an audience for that more specifically. This is more out in the community, what are your great ideas? So we're going to be launching that in the coming couple of weeks here.
So maybe you're already doing this, but just to be responsive to Darylyn's excellent point, will you already be thinking about how to make specific efforts to reach those communities? I just observe I haven't been spending that long coming to city meetings, but I see a lot of familiar faces that come to all of them. And I think the point here is it's on us to.
We are going to have to go. Yes.
Right. So yes, and also this is the first time we're doing it, and I can assure that this will not be the best. We're going to all have to learn together on how to do this. We don't have all the connections into those communities, and part of, I think, starting here is we're going to start to build those. So
if there's any ways that we can help, Donna.
Oh, I actually sent out invitations to a couple of people to attend this meeting online tonight, who all would be described as, as people who aren't normally involved. And they didn't show up. I don't know why, but I'm going to try to reach out a little bit more, because I think that, just asking people if they are interested in just seeing the process and submitting feedback, that they're welcome to do that. I think if every one of us, 2 or 3 people who live in South Burlington that we could invite to just say, hey, we're looking for feedback here, and you're welcome to be on this.
My observation is it's a lot of time and not convenient for everyone at this particular time, and maybe also not necessarily the most effective way for them to provide feedback. So it's great that they're able to do that, but I also appreciate that Paul's coming up with other ways so that we have more options to give them when we reach out to them.
Well, one of the people just happened to have originally been, wanted to be on this committee Maddie, who's on the Bike and Ped committee. She wanted to be on this committee originally, and but I didn't hear back from her, so I don't know.
Srini?
I had actually shared this with Paul and Helen or six weeks ago or so. There were a couple of suggestions from the community on including some representation as part of this team. There was actually a suggestion as a member of the task force.
And we have been working with the school district as one of the pieces to try to get more direct involvement from the student leadership, whether it's serving on the committee or it's taking the ideas here and bringing it into their worlds to be talking about it. There's a little bit of progress. It's not as much as we'd like yet, but the subjects are being worked on. It's, we're building new pathways, so it's not as fast as any of us would like.
And sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but we've talked with the school superintendent. We're identifying how do we find those groups? How do we get them excited about this? So we're on that one.
Good.
It occurs to me that maybe even more important than getting suggestions from those of us on the task force about how to reach these communities, that there may be other leaders or organizations in the community who have a closer connection and a deeper understanding of how to reach those communities and the best way to make it accessible and to frame it in a way that's most likely to get feedback. And so maybe rather than us trying to think of it, we should go to the experts here again. And I don't know exactly who that is, but I bet we know people who are the right people. It's a thought. Any other comments, or can we give Roseanne the floor? All right.
Oh, I just wanted to emphasize something I was looking at in this guiding principles for just transition, and it keeps standing out, and it's the thing I keep trying to remember, the most impacted first. And when I brought up the issues of weatherization, that's why targeting those people, not only who have high energy use, but who are poor, and not able to do these things. I mean, that's a good example of the most, looking at the people who are really impacted by this and targeting them first. And I think we should think about that.
Yeah. And there's actually some good demographics in the slides that Melanie and Ann presented in the early meeting, and seniors, I think, was one of the larger populations that we had that overlapped on that list. So maybe that has that points us toward outreach. Okay. For real, Roseanne.
Okay. Let me just say something about the equity thing. If those of you who have been attended any of the Vermont, climate action plan committee meetings and read their report, you know that they tried to get marginalized members to participate without much success at all. And I know we can speculate on why that is. As you're talking about it, you probably ought to talk about who. Who are you talking about? I heard you talk. Are you talking about young people? Are you talking about seniors? Are you talking about people of color? Are you talking about people of low incomes? Are you talking about homeless? I'm not throwing this out. I don't know. When we talk about equity, there's that word out there, but I don't know that we've ever talked about what does that mean. I think a lot of us hear the word equity and think racist. But now I hear you talking about inviting young people, which would be wonderful, but are they the ones who are marginalized? I mean, their futures are dependent on, on the climate catastrophe. So I think they're going to be impacted. But anyway, I throw that out. And I tell you, you just can't invite them. I mean, if you want to get them excited, you don't throw them spreadsheets. I don't think that excites anybody. And I can't imagine a young person or a senior getting excited about coming to a meeting and looking at spreadsheets. They're probably going to want to talk common language, basic, anyway, but that wasn't the point I wanted to make. The point I wanted to make was something about what Srini was talking about earlier, and the research he's done. And I haven't talked to Srini at all. This is not, speaking for him at all. But it really apparent that he's done a lot of research. It's also really apparent that other communities across the United States and the world are doing things. We are not in the forefront. Other communities are. And so rather than reinvent the wheel, why don't you take, hook, line, and sinker and just use that as a jumping off point rather than, starting to learn how to build fire kind of thing. Obviously all things are not going to fit, but other communities who have done this probably went through this process, and maybe use that as a jumping off point. In Seattle, they did this, and they're doing this for years, or Portland, or whatever. Some things may apply, some things may not, but I think it would really get you off of the spreadsheet and columns and writing things and into, this is the action other communities took. And if you think you're going to get anything done by educating and advising and encouraging and incentivizing, that's not going to do it. It hasn't worked for decades. Regulation is what does it, people stop at red lights because there's a red light. If there's no red light, they're going to go through. If you have a code that says you do this, they'll either do it or they won't. But that's the way change happens. So anyway, that's my 2 cents from listening to you. And thank you for taking this on.
Thank you for those thoughts.
And we only have a few years before we reach the tipping point. I think we're now down to 9 years before we reach the point of no return, that no matter what we do, that's according to climate scientists. So 20-year plans are great, but we don't have 20 years.
9 years to get stuff done, not 9 years to start. Can I respond to those 2 points just very briefly? So one is to remind folks on the task force and the public that on page 23 of tonight's packet is the list from that equity rubric that the state prepared that lists the recommendations about the groups of underrepresented and most impacted communities. So if we want to refresh ourselves, they have done some work for us to outline those, which some we have mentioned and some we haven't. And the second is just to briefly respond. I think your suggestion about looking at other climate action plans is great. I would actually take it a step further, that if we are going to take advantage of the work that's happened in other communities, we look not only at what they came out of a process like this with, but I would be really interested to see if we can find any communities that have published follow-ups and shared what worked and didn't work about the plans that they put out. So we're not just adopting the things that sound good to us from what someone else did, but the things that actually did work. Obviously, we have to put it all through the filter of we're our own city and not everything is going to be the same as Seattle or Atlanta, but that would be the one other.
Ethan, I think that's fantastic. And thank you, Roseanne, for bringing those up. Something that I will say that is always a challenge for me at the staff level is if you can find examples from communities that are scaled somewhere closer to what South Burlington has of 20,000 people, we can always look to the models of the Seattles, the Atlantas, figuring out how to think about how do we do it when we don't have the scales of economy of just being able to create a division to do enforcement. But think about, that's one person. And so you have to sort of train up a person. So the more that we can think of examples of communities between 10 and 100,000 people, that's really, really helpful.
Yeah, Paul, to that point, I was just going to say that, I think you included 2 towns in your initial package when we had the kickoff meeting. Even if you look at those climate action plans, they don't get into a lot of detail. It stays very, very high level. And just to illustrate, the bigger cities, rightfully so, with the more resources and other things that they have access to, have thought through the mechanisms of how to make it happen. So those mechanisms could very well be the same. I don't think it differentiates between a big million population, 500,000 population, and 20,000 populations. I think the mechanisms are different, are the same. It is how you go about making it happen is what may be different for South Burlington. So, Boston, for example, I think I shared some of this with you guys. Boston and Montgomery County in Maryland have excellent, the detail that they have gone through to illustrate these plans and actually look at progress is worth looking at as a benchmark.
Well, what about Burlington? I just read somewhere that they're on. They're one of the top of the cities, top cities in the country that are going to net zero. They're right next door, But I think there are examples around. Maybe doing a little research on that would be well worth some time and effort.
And I think Burlington is worth looking at, and I think they did theirs a long time ago. Maybe
They did. Yep, they did. Yep. And
Yeah.
that. Yep.
So-
That's whatever.
Burlington has
Can I
done,
suggest,
I imagine some of us have read through that plan. I know I have. It's very aspirational without a lot of concrete, how are we going to do it? Can you do it?
well, they
But they
have
still
done,
have more net zero. They're almost net zero. The
Well, we
results are what I'm talking about, not the plan. Yeah.
fired. Yeah.
one of the things they have done is a lot of commercial benchmarking. Virtually all the large scale buildings in Burlington have had benchmarking studies done. And they have identified for the larger structures, audits, they know what has to be done. They haven't done it all, but they know what has to be done. And they also understand, and this is a climate thing, that getting to net zero in larger buildings is not necessarily 100% possible for larger buildings. So just, you have to be aware of when you say net zero that it's near net zero is probably the best you can get on certain types of buildings.
so can I suggest, this is a useful discussion that probably would be even more helpful if we can turn it into some takeaways that we get from the plans, either finding a couple good ones that we really like or finding some commonalities that we want to make sure that we emulate. It seems like this is probably more homework that we should all be doing, but can I suggest that it would probably be most productive if we take advantage of the size of the team and if everyone could share. It seems like maybe we should share through a common point. Does someone want to take responsibility for collecting those and organizing them? Or I can take them in if you want to send me links and comments and then I'll compile them and send them back, or Srini?
I'm happy to send. There are 3 cities that really stand out. Of course, big cities, but really stand out and well done. I'll share them to you, and then you figure out, whether it's appropriate to share all that with the rest of the team. So.
Well, yeah, I'm happy to collect these. I've been working on gathering a list of climate action plans from cities, and I actually have a team of students in Massachusetts right now working on. They're supposed to be this week organizing some high-level attributes of those plans. So if you send me more, maybe I can even get them to spend some time helping to organize some of the stuff, make our jobs a little easier.
Good. So do you need a motion to approve the minutes?
Yes, thank you. That is the next thing on the list.
I so move.
Thank you. Second, anyone?
I'll second.
Second. Okay, great. Thank you, Donna. And all in favor of approving the minutes as proposed? Looks like that's everyone. And we've got what, 5 of us. We hung on to quorum here. Okay, good. Yes. Okay, minutes are approved. Anyone opposed, or that was everyone, right? Okay. Can't count anymore apparently at this time of day. Any other? I think we've covered all the other business, unless going once, going twice. All right, we've got our takeaways. Thanks everyone for sticking around late.
Great.
Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Everybody.